Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today for the IAASF podcast. So this podcast is organized by the International Arts and Antiquity Security Forum in collaboration with Trademana Limited. I'm Valentina Sabucco, and with me today there is Khamal Patterson, who is the Cultural Heritage Law Analyst for ARTIVE. Hello, Khamal. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hello, Valentina. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for your time and your interest.
Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. And so I'll go straight to the questions I have for you today. So really, looking at your bio, I was quite interested. It feels like you have a lot of experience for what concerns like antiquity trades, art restitutions. So I was wondering, what are the reasons that led you to that specific field that is very particular, let's say?
Well, that's actually a really excellent question. And the origin story behind that actually changes as I begin to really think about, my first encounters with cultural heritage. And probably one of the first instances that I can really think of was when I was an elementary school student. My headmaster told me the story of the golden stool of the Ashanti that the British had captured. And so, it made me really think about, how people's, traditions, beliefs, and customs, whether they're in an intangible form or a tangible form, they inform people's identity, right? And when you understand a nation or a tribe's or country's, beliefs and customs in this, you can really do some damage if you remove, items that are vessels for their identity, for their legitimacy, for their overall heritage. So that was probably one of the first instances where I saw the power that cultural heritage has and how it can be misused or manipulated.
Yeah.
And as I grew up, I took courses in world history, and we learned about how over time, various world cultures displace other world cultures. Even when we look at, the built heritage of the United States, several of the monuments that we now have were built on top of former Native American sacred lands. And when we look at the, kind of amateur archaeology in places in the United States, people often find arrowheads and other artifacts of the former inhabitants. But when we remove those things, it destroys the provenance, understanding the archaeological and cultural record of the nations that existed prior or sometimes contemporaneous with European colonists. So I really think about these issues in terms of heritage and memory, and looking at the evolution of laws that protect them, and their inadequacy oftentimes compelled the creation of new laws to address the deficiency in old laws. So it's one of those things where when I finally got to college, I really looked at the issue of cultural heritage law, not really as like a body of law, but just as a way to do something to correct the narrative of cultural displacement or cultural erasure, and sometimes just moral justice. So when I finally got to law school, I had a teacher that spoke about Nazi looted art and restitution of art and manuscripts taken from Jewish families, and that really it is something that really touched me and made me really want to know more about this field. So upon graduation, I did some research, and I was very lucky to have gotten an internship with Marc Masurovsky, who's an expert in Holocaust art restitution, and he's the director and co-founder of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project. So at heart, I worked on issues of repatriation of Native American cultural and sacred objects. I looked at a bill that was currently before Congress and provided some commentary and a memo for an attorney that was looking at issues surrounding this bill that was going to remove procedural barriers that were erected that prevented Holocaust heirs from being able to bring claims. So all of these various experiences and encounters really shaped my interest in cultural heritage and eventually cultural heritage law.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a very fascinating path, and I think what I like is that also you mentioned the importance of intangible heritage, because it's like sometimes when we talk about restitution, we tend to focus on the object itself, but also the fact that a specific population is not able to enjoy the specific object or to use it, then it also like it has a negative impact on the possible traditions that are associated to that object, to that item. So there is also like consideration that needs to go around for what concerns the intangible part as well, not just the tangible. So it's really fascinating path, and it's also fascinating to see how one step led you to the following one, like it's kind of gradual path. So that is very interesting, which I think all of these together led you to your current position. So like as a cultural heritage law analyst. So like I'm just thinking, what can you tell me about your tasks? What consists on? What does a law analyst do?
So I look at various issues related to copyright, national heritage laws, and related to like such as cultural patrimony laws that are passed at the state level. I look at the international conventions that apply to cultural heritage, such as UNESCO 1970 and Hague 1954. So we're all, I look at various laws and kind of make some, assessments about the applicability of those laws to artifacts that are in circulation. And currently, ARTIVE is now working in partnership with another cultural heritage tech nonprofit called the Art Project on protecting artifacts in Syria that are at a museum. So now I'm looking at issues of cultural heritage and technology, the intersection between those two, because we'll be working in Syria, looking at whether the work we do, the limitations of that, right? Because we will be working with various groups, so we want to make sure that we're not running afoul of any international laws as it relates to the sharing of data with people who might not always have the most, how should I say this, clean record. So, we're doing that process of due diligence and vetting. So, and then also looking at the copyright issues. The community in Syria will own the copyright in the kind of photographs and things that they will upload to ARTIVE and ARTIVE's database and the Art Project's database. But there's so many, facets to, when we look at cultural property issues. There's copyright issues, there's issues related to treaties and, constitutional stuff on the American side, looking at export laws and domestic laws. So it's a bricolage of various types of law that, I'm looking at to see its applicability to what we do and into the, projects in which we're engaged.
I think this is a very complicated process because, like, of course, different countries might have, and I'm going back to UNESCO conventions, so they might have ratified specific conventions while others might not have yet. So, of course, like you want to make sure that when you do your research, you do take these differences into considerations. So it is a very, like, I would say, complex task that does really involve a lot of background research, and especially the organization you work for, ARTIVE, they're very specialized in due diligence checks for everything that concerns our market and antiquities trade as well. So what would you say is the most challenging part of the job, if there is one?
You know what? It's keeping up with the developments. Anti-money laundering laws are all the rage. And, we're looking at, the industry side versus what, legislators would like to pass, and kind of the kind of glamorous idea of how art and antiquities are used in money laundering, but then also balancing that with the empiricism, because there are so many, scholars and experts who are saying that, this very Netflix movie idea of art trafficking or antiquities trafficking and money laundering, the nexus isn't always as clear, and a lot of times it's very country specific. So these kind of overarching criminal syndicates that operate in the shadows, that work with oligarchs and crooked businessmen, a lot of times, there's some definite pushback, and people are trying to get empirical evidence to support or disprove kind of the way that the money laundering is viewed, and how legislation actually may not, address money laundering in a way that it's used in the art market, and actually may chill or harm the free and reasonably regulated flow of art and antiquities between countries.
I see. Yeah, it's and also like, yeah, so I totally understand your point. And I'm also thinking like, because like we mentioned about like the development, the changes that can happen as well. If we look at the illicit trafficking and also art restitutions, we have seen in recent years, I would say, that there has been an increase in restitutions, like successful ones. So for example, we have seen in Germany, in certain cases in the UK, in France, and in other countries worldwide, restitution of objects that were previously looted during war, during colonizations, and so they've been given back to their origin country. So I was thinking, what is your thoughts about it? Do you think like, is this definitely a good sign? So is there like more awareness on the importance to give artifacts back to today or to their communities, or there is still like a long way to go?
That's actually a really excellent question, and it's one that I'm actually wrestling with in a paper that I'm working on with Dr. Antonio Kyler of the University of Michigan. We are analyzing the state of restitution in France as it relates to African colonial art and artifacts. And so, I was speaking with Dr. Kyler the other day, and I think really when we talk about restitution, it really depends on the country. There was this grand pronouncement from Emmanuel Macron of France, and about the restitution of African artifacts, and then the French Parliament passed a law that suspended the rule of inalienability for of artifacts that belong to France for 26, I believe, objects. But the problem is the sheer volume of artifacts that are in places like France, and how the fact that there's so many objects that are in national museums in France, those 26 are really a drop in the bucket. And unless you're really talking about looking at changing French law, either in French national law or it's private law as it relates to ownership of artifacts from the colonial period, then you're really going to see these drips of artifacts that really, to restitute a substantial part of objects that were looted in that fashion, it would take decades, centuries. So, we're looking at whether restitution is something that countries are really committed to in any substantive way. And unfortunately, that kind of wave that France was, the wave has kind of crested, since I think it was 2017 when he made the announcement. I think in 2019, I think they passed the law that restituted the 26 objects. Since then, there's only been one object that has been restituted, which is a French-made sword that belonged to an anti-colonial fighter in Senegal named Omar Saidou Tall. So, there are other objects that France says that it will give back, but, hasn't really done so in any appreciable way. But when you look at Germany, Germany is really saying like, look, we have some of the famous Benin bronzes. We'll return the ones that are in our collections by 2022. They're working with African countries on provenance research for, objects that were taken during German occupation of East Africa. Like we're really seeing that like Germany seems to be very committed in a way that France is not. And then on the flip side, when we talk about like Holocaust art, there are certain countries that, have done things, they've built, museums to Jewish history, and they've done many wonderful things to acknowledge the contributions of Jewish people to the history and founding of their country. But on the side of restitution, it's still messy. And the country which I'm alluding to is Poland. Poland still has a long way to go as it relates to restitution claims, but so do other European nations. I think that, a lot of that is politics. There's a wave of kind of nationalism that is going on in certain European countries, particularly some that were the most devastated during World War II, because of a failure to acknowledge collaboration. It has made, collaboration with the Nazi regime, private civilians or citizens. There's this idea that people should just heal and move on, but you can't heal and move on when you are creating controversy that creates the conditions for people to have their claims stifled, and their claims are being stifled because academia in working with the government has revised or engaged in revisionist history that makes people's claims, that tries to diminish people's claims to items. So, restitution, because provenance is such an important part, and because the archives and academic material that's necessary for heirs to make claims, it's really important. But if the academy, if the government are controlled by people who have a vested interest in diminishing claims by rewriting history, then we really have a serious challenge to restitution, particularly in the European context.
Yeah, because this is really, I would say, a debated topic, because sometimes looking at social media and what is published, I'm not talking really by organizations that do this as a job, but I'm talking by individual, like it can be me, through my personal account. I keep seeing lots of different points of view about this matter. So there's always people that say, oh, if, for example, I'm take a very famous case, which is the Parthenon marbles that are kept and stored and displayed at the British Museum. So if we take these, this is one of the most probably discussed topic when we talk about restitution. Is one of those debates that has been going on for ages, where Greece would like to have the marbles back and the UK still have them. So if you think about this one, I've seen some comments of people saying, oh, we should keep these in the UK because this is the place where they have been displayed for many, many years, and this is where people go. And the fact of having them in the UK, it doesn't mean that people don't know that originally these marbles were in Greece. It all depends on how the interpretation is done. What is the history that goes with this marble? How is it told by the museum, etc., etc. But then on the other side, alongside these comments, you have other comments from other people that say, well, actually, no, this is not correct. These marbles should go back to their origin country because this is where they were created, and this is where they should be stored and they should be displayed. And the fact that they are in the UK, they also damage potentially the tourism, because if they were in Greece, people to see them would go to Greece rather than the UK. So you have really different point of views. And I think there can be positive aspects in both. So it's quite difficult for me, at least, sometimes to see like to make a stand and say, okay, I think like these are rights, because I think that there are elements from both sides that you can say that they are right, but equally on the other side, yes, you can kind of argue, well, is it really the case? So what is your personal opinion about restitutions? So should they be like items that have been taken in the past from the origin country due to colonization, due to war or other episodes, should they be restituted whenever possible? And if yes, are there specific conditions that should be agreed in order for this to happen? Or should it just be restituted and, without negotiating, for example, how and where they will be displayed or for how long? Or should they stay in the original, in the country where they are at the moment?
That is another really excellent question. It's one that I wrestle with as well. I'm one that I look at, restitution on an individual basis, but I think there are some instances where the event that occurred that occurred and the object was taken or looted or removed. Sometimes those things are so egregious where like it's almost immoral to keep an object that came out of that particular scenario, or one where it would offend our kind of dignity and sensibility as human beings. And there's one example that I can think of that's a success story, and it involves a garment that was removed from the body of I believe it was a Lakota Sioux warrior during the wars out west in the United States. This warrior was a practitioner of a religion called the Ghost Dance religion, which it really developed in response to American expansionism and breaking of treaties and settler encroachment on their traditional lands. It was kind of a way, it was a way of healing, but it was also a way of, shoring up oneself and one's culture, at, girding oneself spiritually to deal with, these often violent conflicts with settlers and also United States military forces. So there was, the garment was removed from this fallen soldier, and some of the members of the unit that fought him were Scots. And this garment ended up in what was known as like a traveling Wild West show that was in Scotland. So it was acquired in Scotland eventually by, I believe, it was like as a museum in Glasgow where this shirt was displayed. And so, there had been calls, by the tribe and their descendants, for the return of the shirt. And there was, all of these, kind of negotiations. And, at first they were rebuffed, but eventually there was a turn. And I believe it was the Glasgow Municipal Council, I think, had authority over the museum. And they eventually, I think, in contact with the museum board, they voted to return the shirt. And I think that the reason why it was because, when we look at Scotland's history of occupation by Great Britain and the use of Scottish soldiers in the British Army, throughout the world, you reach a point where you really consider that, oppression in a lot of ways is linked. So even though you had these Scottish soldiers in the British military, they recognize that, hey, we don't want to be a part of, or we understand that history is history, but there's a moral component to it. We stand now in solidarity with people's whose situation of occupation or displacement was similar to ours. So I think sometimes when we look at restitution, there's a moral reckoning or reconciliation that happens when people decide to restitute objects. And I think that when we look at those individual cases, restitution becomes really powerful when it's to stand in solidarity, to right a wrong. I think that it's really important when we talk about restitution on a large scale. For objects, there's complexity there, social relations between colonists and natives, or whomever the group might be complicated. But that's where good provenance research is important for understanding that context. And I think when sometimes we talk about objects are in Europe, like using France and Tunisia and Algeria as examples. The French took archives with them before independence. So if there's an object of French or Tunisian origin in France, decide, well, how was that object, was it looted? What, all of the records of that object's history are in France. So it would be up to it's one of those things where the French who took it are really the only ones in the position to, use the materials that they also took to really make that determination. But in those instances, collaboration between, French officials and academics and their counterparts in Algeria and Tunisia becomes so critical and important, because, if we want to, we want to talk about building equity for the countries that were colonized, whose items were took. Well, let's use the archival training. Let's share that data. Let's share that training so that both sides can engage in the process of restitution, which is really, it's a negotiation between two. We know that there's unequal power, and that should be recognized. And when possible, there should be, like training, access should be made available so that, we can understand, or, even when, the particular European country may lose interest, therefore, the people that are in their former colonies can still continue that work to determine the scope of what was taken, and then also the scope of what should be restituted based on, certain conditions, duress, coercion, outright, sometimes some instances, things that would be classified as murder or assassinations, such as, the Belgians in the Congo, objects that were taken that were commissioned in figures that were commissioned in commemoration of leaders. We need to look at all of these, aspects, but that's going to require equal access to resources and training.
Yeah. And particularly on training, I'm going to focus a little bit, because I think this is very important. So now there are a lot of organizations that have done like workshop now during the pandemic. Most of them have been online, but to try to raise awareness on the fact that certain objects, like looted objects, can be found in markets, and as such they can be also bought by tourists. So there have been courses also done by UNESCO, for example, that were explaining the way different levels. So some were more for professional audience, others were more for everyone, really, even those that are not expert or are not working in the sector, to try to understand how to behave and what to do when you see some objects that they might be old, they look old, you see them on the market, but you might not be aware of what is their provenance. So it might be that they've been looted and they're now resell. So it's I think, like training, as you were saying, it is important, because people, especially tourists in certain cases, they don't really know how to understand how to assess if that object has been looted or stolen. So they don't really know and they don't conduct due diligence checks. So in terms of training, but also more broadly, so what do you think are actions or policies or steps that should be taken in order to decrease this problem, or at least to tackle it in a better way?
Well, I think that you actually raised an excellent point about education and engagement. of people that, particularly tourists that are going into these heritage rich source countries, to let them know, what these objects that might be prohibited or protected by cultural patrimony law, what they look like, and
Yeah.
I think in a lot of ways when we talk about like governments have, some of the greatest sources of information, ensuring that, departments of state or, um, produce literature in conjunction with travel agency or for travel agencies and other bodies that, help people arrange trips, like creating that awareness of the types of objects that you need to look out for, because one, you don't want, your citizens to run afoul of a country's domestic cultural patrimony laws, or, from taking something from one country to another, you know, when they come back home, they might be subject to, federal laws that prohibit that type of, removal or taking, or you don't want someone to go through the process of, a forfeiture of
Yeah.
objects. So I think the next step is, industry and, trade associations really, working together through, across, types of objects to kind of create this kind of like a consortium of people that work together to address the issue of, heritage trafficking. And then I think another thing occurs at the state level, like another way of engagement occurs at the state level. So we talk about like bilateral treaties concerning the protection of cultural heritage, and ensuring that there are more of those. Also looking at countries who have not yet ratified UNESCO 1970, or if they've ratified them, you know, advocating and encouraging them, helping them to draft implementing legislation,
Yeah.
because that's an issue. And then also when we look at the 1995 UNIDROIT, which, encourages the creation of a system where courts can be used to restitute objects. Several, major Western countries have not, signed on to that, for, various reasons or complex reasons. But, when we look at countries like France that have private law that vests title in objects, even if they are illicit, that creates, issues for, the person or nation, or, even, tribe that, that has been deprived.
Yeah.
So, looking at all of those, on like a state level, those are, ways that we can address cultural heritage trafficking, and then begin a process or of restitution and heritage protection between countries, and within the trade as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really, and I'm following up with what you just said, like education should be at all levels. So it should go from the individual, the person that might go on holiday, up to the government. So through the implementations of different regulations and policies, because as you rightly point out, the fact of ratifying, I could mention, is already a good step. But then if that is not followed by the implementation of that, then it kind of remains a standalone policy that does not follow up with that. So really implementation, that is important, and really education should be across all levels of society, so that everyone is aware of the problem, and more importantly, everyone knows what to do if he or she finds themselves in this specific situation. So I think this leads us to the end of the podcast. Thank you very much, Khamal, for the amazing feedback that you have provided and the topics discussed. It's been amazing to have you as person. So thank you very much for your time. And yeah, again, thanks for all the information you have provided.
Well, Valentina, it was truly a delight. I had a wonderful time. Thank you so much. And I definitely look forward to working with you again and having another conversation about this topic that's so broad and expansive and has so many dimensions. So thank you.
Absolutely. And for those who are listening to us, I just would like to remember that we have a coming up conference on the 23rd and 24th of June, which is dedicated to the protection of cultural heritage during the pandemic, where we're going to discuss adversarial threats to cultural heritage. And there will be a section dedicated to illicit trafficking as well. So for those of you who will be in the UK or travel restrictions aside, will be allowed to travel, we look forward to have you at the conference. I don't know, Khamal, if you will be able to join us for that event, or maybe it's a little bit too close. I don't know in terms of regulation how it's going to be, if it's feasible or not for you.
Well, I would definitely love to attend, and I'll tell as many people as I can about it, and actually have shared it. I don't know if I'll be able to have the pleasure this year, but I hope that you'll be able to tell me all about it. And some of the, read the program and reach out to some of the presenters, because it's fantastic and dynamic and program that you all put together.
Thank you very much, Khamal. So we hope to see you then for the next edition of the conference. We do it every year. So this year, unfortunately, COVID has posed many challenges for many people who would like to attend it. But hopefully going forward, the situation will improve everywhere. So next edition would be it would be easier for people to attend. Once again, thank you very much, Khamal, for your time. It was a pleasure to have you on this podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine.